Oh, sorry. I got a clicker too.
Yeah.
All right, if we're ready, I'd like to call the Lakes and Water Quality Committee meeting for Thursday, July 16, 2020 to order. Our first item on the agenda is roll call. Can we just go around the room and do the roll call? Debbie, do you want to start?
Start with me. I'm Debbie Kraft. I live on Schutz Lake.
Steve Mullen, Pearson Lake.
Ann Hilscher, Lake Minnetonka.
Fisher at large.
Nolan Barron, Lake Auburn.
Craig Eggers, Lake Virginia.
Dick Hawley, Lake December Sunny.
Alyssa Swanson, Assistant to the City Manager.
Marty Dahl, Community and Economic Development Director.
Great, thank you. It's nice to see everyone in person, or most of you kind of in person with the mask on. Next, we need to adopt the agenda. Do I have a motion to adopt the final agenda as submitted?
Move we adopt the agenda as submitted.
Second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Next, we need to approve the minutes. I assume everyone has had a chance to review the minutes from May 14, 2020. If so, I'd be looking for a motion to approve the minutes as submitted. I'll make that motion. Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
I'm just abstaining because I didn't have a chance to read over them.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, motion carries. Minutes are approved. Next, agenda item 3, the discussion of the Shoreland Management Ordinance. And I will turn it over to staff for their report.
Thank you, Chair, members of the committee. As you know, we have been painstakingly working through an update to the city's shoreline management ordinance. We've had several meetings up to this point, and we have several more that are on the calendar. Our most recent discussion on this was on Monday night during the workshop with the City Council, just to bring them up to speed as to where we are now. And as part of the presentation, I've got some of their feedback that they provided as to our current status and some of the things we talked about. So where we are today, as you know, we have gone through several revisions and red lines of the DNR model ordinance. We've talked in joint groups with the Planning Commission and individually with the Planning Commission and this group as well to keep working on trying to craft this ordinance in a way that is acceptable to all parties and beneficial to the community. We also, for those of you who were able to review the red line ordinance in your packet, we have gotten some initial DNR feedback on some of those items. So we'll be talking about those as well tonight. So at tonight's meeting, we're planning to kind of discuss those highlights of the current red line, the DNR and council feedback that we've received, and we are looking to seek any further feedback to bring to the Planning Commission next week. So similar to the areas that we've been focused on in the past, this is a list of the areas that staff will be highlighting tonight. Of course, feel free if there are other issues that are not on this list to let us know and bring them up. I do have a copy of the draft ordinance that we can pull up on the screen to review as well. So with that, let's get to it. So the first section we've started kind of working through, and we've gotten some initial feedback from the DNR on our definitions. There are some items you'll have noticed as we walked through that the DNR has requested that we revert back to the DNR definitions, which were noted in that red line. But one of the items that I think needs some discussion from this group as well as our Planning Commission is the DNR's request or question as to how permeable walkways and permeable patios are going to be defined and measured in the Shoreland district. So in the current red line version, we have a section that calls for lot coverage shall not include projections for bay windows, permeable walkways, e.g. flagstones, swimming pools, fences, walls, and open pattern docks, permeable patios, and stairways that are installed over a permeable surface. In the DNR's feedback, they had asked to see some more specific definition for permeable walkways. They had indicated that a flagstone path is fine to be excluded from impervious calculation, but it's just an example. And they also questioned with whether a permeable pavement path would be allowed. Would a permeable pavement patio be allowed, and are there size limits as they've seen some of these structures taken to extreme? Just to kind of kick off the discussion tonight, I did do a little bit of research and pulled some verbiage together that is, again, nothing that needs to be set in stone, but just some kicking off points for how we may want to consider defining a permeable patio and a permeable walkway based on some language that are in other city ordinances. As any patio or walkway designed to facilitate the infiltration of water into the soil, a permeable patio or walkway must be constructed in a way that allows water to channel or absorb into the underlying soil or into a special storage layer and not create runoff. Permeable patios and walkways shall meet the following conditions. All materials shall be installed per industry standards. Appropriate soils and site conditions shall exist for the pervious pavement or pervious pavement system to function. Shall be constructed of a grid of pavers or stone with void spaces filled with turf, sand, or gravel. Shall include an effective permeable sublayer of at least 12 inches, and then some restriction or guidance on the maximum size that we would want to allow that would still count towards pervious surface and not count against that impervious calculation. So with that, I will kick it over to the committee to discuss and ask questions.
I just have one question. Where did this sample definition come from?
It is a combination of some things I found today. I found some good language. The city of Chicago had some language. The city of Seattle had some language. There was some industry language that I found that spoke to some of these definitions and what those, the industry standards related to the sublayer are. So it's kind of a hodgepodge of a few different sources that I pulled together here for the base of the discussion.
So other cities that adopt or have adopted the DNR ordinance don't have a provision regarding permeable?
They do not. They do not. This is something, and if we go back to the definition, so this is something that is in the city's existing impervious surface definition, was the permeable walkways and patios. So we are looking, again, this was one of those definitions we carried over from our general definitions. And so as a result of that, the DNR flagged that and had the questions about how that permeable would be defined.
Okay, one last question. Did the samples that you looked at have a number in there for the amount of square footage?
I was not able to find anything in my first go-round to look for a size limitation. It's something that I can do a little bit more digging on, but we just received the DNR's feedback on this not that long ago, and so in the short time I've had to look into it, I wasn't able to find anything.
Do you have a suggestion regarding that?
I do not. I think we would need a little more guidance. If the committee doesn't have a preference or a suggestion, I think we need to get some more guidance from the DNR as to what they would feel would be acceptable on that limitation.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. I have a question. What is the allowable impervious?
25% is the allowable impervious in residential.
Okay, and I would suggest there's a difference between concrete and asphalt versus pavers or some of the other things. So is it possible to do a, like if you have a, 10 by 10 patio of asphalt or concrete, more likely, that's 100%, and something that has pavers that has impervious components to it would be a lesser percent of taking up that percentage. Does that make sense?
Yes, correct. And I think that's what we were trying to accomplish with this, is that something like just regular concrete or asphalt would still constitute as impervious surface and would count towards that calculation. But if we are saying that a permeable patio or a permeable walkway is allowed to not count against that, the DNR is asking us to try to define what that means. To your point, is that a paver system with certain restrictions or size restrictions?
Mm-hmm. My initial thoughts.
Nolan?
Mark, can you go to the next slide?
Yeah.
Bullet points. So the bottom bullet point, permeable patio or walkway, area in excess of whatever the number is. Once you exceed that number, then it counts towards.
That would be the intention, right, is that, that wouldn't preclude someone from putting more impervious, or a larger impervious patio. It would just be that would then count towards their impervious surface maximum that they would not be able to exceed. So if someone wanted to make a pervious patio that's larger than what we are considering to be a pervious system, we would count up to that size as pervious, and then anything beyond that would count towards the impervious surface. And assuming they still have the capacity in their 25%, they would be able to do that. Does that make sense?
So permeable patios count towards the 25%.
Only up to, beyond whatever we decide our size would be, right? In this, again, very draft and hodgepodge together discussion bullets.
I would go back to the, again, if you have a 10 by 10 and it's pavers, there's space in between them, and what percentage of that? So if it's 100 square feet, maybe it's 25% pervious and 75% impervious. So of that 75% of that 100 square feet or 75 feet would be counting toward your, so your patio could be as big as you want, but if it's 75% paver, or if it's 100% pavers, 75% pervious of those pavers, then that 25% of that 1,000 square foot would go toward your 25. Of course, then you wouldn't be able to do it, but you know what I'm saying? Rather than going, if it's bigger than 100 square feet, then 100% of that it counts as impervious pavement. It sounds like the way that's worded right now, it sounds like if you go over an inch over whatever that minimum is, then 100% of that patio is now considered impervious.
I don't think the intention would be that 100%. I think it would be anything beyond that
Okay.
point. But that is another way that this could be potentially written, is versus a maximum size. We determine what systems we think we would allow to count towards pervious for patios and walkways, and then determine what percentage of those systems would be considered
But then what
pervious.
happens when new systems come along?
Right.
Do we?
Right.
Right.
Which hopefully are better.
Right.
I was thinking how like parking lots, it's like Mount Olivet, they have a big section of their parking lot that is impervious ground cover pavers for their parking lot, so that they meet that criteria. So I don't know if you can extrapolate that into a residential scenario or not, but.
Other thoughts?
A couple of things. First of all, when you were looking for definitions, did you consult with the watershed district at all? Because I know they went.
I haven't specifically about this definition. I have sent them over a copy of this full, most updated red line draft, but I have not followed up with them yet to talk about anything
I
specifically.
believe they worked up some information on the effectiveness of pervious pavers for driving on, I don't know, or parking, I'm not sure what else they did, but, and to that end, I gotta believe that there is some data out there that says for a given type of pervious or semi-pervious material, how effective is it compared to bare soil or vegetated soil particularly? And if there is such information, you could, I think this may be what Deb was alluding to, you could assign a appropriate percentage of effectiveness to the pervious surface requirement. And if you can't do that, I would still look at limiting the size in such a way that it's somehow proportional to the pervious surface requirement. In other words, if your pervious surface requirement is, half an acre, in other words, you have 4 acres and it's 25% of the 4 acres, then the allowable pervious type material in area should be larger than for somebody that has a 10th acre pervious requirement. It makes no sense to say you can have something that's,
Right.
this is all based on the notion that these pervious systems aren't 100% effective. If they are 100% effective, then there's really no difference. but it's my understanding that they're more typically about 50% effective.
Right.
I don't think that there is any direct correlation between the percentage of pervious material within the semi-pervious area, because the water tends to fall through the cracks. I'm sure there is some relationship between what percentage of the surface is actually impervious versus not, but it's not going to be a direct correlation at all. And typically there's standards for how they're installed anyway, and I think if you just say, if you go by this standard, here's the percentage, the effectiveness that we expect. If you deviate that from that, then you get somebody's engineer's opinion as to what that particular system is going to be in terms of effectiveness. One other comment that's just marginally related to this, I don't know if you already have this in there, but crushed rock and pretty much any driveway surface shouldn't ever be considered pervious. In the past it was. I don't know if you've got that in the current description of
Yeah,
pervious.
I'm fairly certain that even in our current ordinance and in the updated ordinance that we constitute all gravel as impervious, any sort of crushed rock.
Just want to make sure you check
I will confirm that, but I'm fairly certain it is in the current ordinance and is in the new ordinance that any gravel is considered
I
impervious.
recommend you get in touch with the watershed. They have engineering staff who studies this stuff. And if they don't know the answer, they either know how to get it or at least be able to direct you to an appropriate resource. That's one of their jobs is to support the cities with this kind of information.
So I'm hearing, I think if we can work with the watershed district or the DNR to figure out what it is, what that calculation is, or what their recommendation, either percentage or size, we're on board with this type of definition once we can get some of the science behind it.
And the overall goal should be that it's equivalent performance.
All right. Any other questions or feedback on this section? Moving on, so non-conformities, this is something we've talked about in some depth. This is, as of right now, one of the flexibility requests in the ordinance as it is based on the existing ordinance language. It is something that in previous planning commission meetings, they expressed some desire to try to maintain the flexibility to allow this sort of non-conformity to happen. There's two pieces to this that we'll talk about here and some feedback from the DNR on these. The first speaks to any additions or expansions to the outside dimension of any existing non-conforming structure located outside of the shore impact zone. That is something that was added in based on DNR feedback, outside of the shore impact zone, which is 50% of the setback, on a non-conforming lot may be permitted without a variance, provided that they do not encroach further to the water. So if their nonconformity is that they are at 75 feet versus 100 feet, they are still able to expand to the side, but not closer to the water. That they do not increase in height beyond what is allowed in this section. So as this is written, that would say that they could not get any higher than 35 feet, which is what would be required. That they'd adhere to any additional setback standards of the underlying zoning district. That would be the side yard setbacks that are not necessarily shoreland specific, but that would be for whatever district they are in for their neighboring properties, and that they would not exceed the allowable impervious surface standards. So any addition could not get them beyond the 25%. So essentially they can expand as long as they don't go closer to the water, they don't get higher than is allowed, they don't get closer to than what is allowed to their side properties, and they don't exceed their impervious surface. The DNR's feedback on this was that, again, the flexibility was not appropriate for structures in that shore impact zone, which is that 50% of the setback. So that's something we've already redlined into that definition, as you saw, that it would only be applicable if they're already outside of the shore impact zone based on the setback. And then their second feedback was they're open to this idea, but they need to see some offsetting higher standard to allow that. So something, the example they gave would be requiring restoration of riparian vegetation to an established riparian buffer standard would work. So essentially saying we'll allow you to do this, but if you've got turf grass to the water's edge, you need to restore that to a natural shoreline as opposed to what it is now. Thoughts on this?
First of all, there's a technical error in there. If you back up a page, it says into the required OHWL. The OHWL is a line. I think he means toward.
Toward. And that may just be an error on my slide.
And I'm assuming what this basically means is if the structure is already more than 50% of the way into the required setback, that they couldn't expand it in width.
Correct.
I would also assume that if they want to expand a portion that wasn't within 50% of the setback, that they could expand that portion. In other words, if the front of the structure was encroaching that limit, that they could expand a point further back that was outside that 50% of the setback. Is that correct?
I don't know if we've thought through that. If the property sits, as you're saying, half of it encroaches beyond that 50% and half of it doesn't.
But they might be expanding
Yep.
behind
that 50%
I
line.
think you should be clarifying what your intent is there, at least. It's not all expansions are at the front wall. And the final comment I have is, I think the idea of requiring some kind of mitigation is desirable. However, in the case of a homeowner, the chances of you actually getting what you are asking for is awfully slim, so you might look for some structural improvement rather than a vegetative improvement, or else require some kind of contract like you would with a CUP that requires that to be maintained, because there's a really good chance that somebody will take advantage of that and say, yeah, sure, we'll put in a vegetative buffer, throw out a few seeds, and then mow it the next year. Again, an alternative would be the structural improvement, some kind of drainage, something or other, a swale or whatever that was more likely to stay.
Depending on the property, there could be all sorts of different alternatives of things they could do. Do we want to lock them into one thing, or, I mean, how do you set that up just to have an improvement?
It would be appropriate to say you have to do a vegetative buffer. I would at least have a...
There may be some that already have an existing vegetative buffer, so then.
Yeah, so they couldn't do anything. Yeah, so, and again, there are structural things that can be done that are as good or better. I don't know if the watershed district has this directly. The Freshwater Society has a published book on what they call waterscaping, which is got a lot of ideas about what can be done to improve the retention of runoff on a lake shore. Look at that and see if you can come up with ideas from there.
I would agree. I think I heard you say something about restoring it to natural or something like that. And there's some things that can be done that are better than how the environment might have been prior. Like, say you remove buckthorn and you plant some native grass buffers and some deeper rooted clover and things like that could be better than a buckthorn, or what a lot of people just do is plant Kentucky bluegrass, which doesn't have deep roots and isn't all that great of a buffer, or, so I'm not quite, I just remember hearing something about natural, which makes me think, oh, well, I've got to go back to the way that it was. And I think even like Waterford Landing, they removed a lot of the buckthorn, and then I think they planted some other more natural things that, native plants that would be a better buffer, better for water runoff. Am I kind of accurate, Lance? You're closer to it.
I don't recall them actually doing any plantings.
Okay.
And yes, anything that's put in should be native. We pretty much can't put in invasives.
So couldn't you just do something like, say, they need to do something restorative, including but not limited to,
Yeah.
name some things, and then say, or other, things that are approved by the city, or, whatever, to make it, put in what we know, but leave some room for new ideas as they come forward.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
exactly where I was tracking based on this, is that we write the ordinance in such a way that it is, needs to have some offsetting, restorative action, including but not limited to some of these ideas.
You're also going to have to figure out how to get some kind of proportionality. If they're adding 3 feet of width to a structure that's 80 feet wide, the impact of that is pretty minimal compared to doubling the width of a 50-foot structure. And the mitigation should be appropriate to increase. And it's going to be tricky to do that. You'll never get it perfect, but at least make the attempt to get something like that. And then again, if you can find prescriptive type items to implement, that you could then require a certain amount of them or a certain performance, that would work better.
Excellent.
Am I understanding this right, that if this is a non-conforming structure and it's like a 1-story one, I could come in and make it a 3-story as long as it's not above 35 feet tall?
With this, there would, the way it's written now, there would be
Yeah.
the potential that you could increase it to up to what's allowed within the zoning district, yes.
The
If
35
it's not-
feet?
Yep.
That's a pretty big change.
Yep. There's always an opportunity to say that it is limited to its existing height. I mean, that's something that can be considered as well. But yeah, I believe the way it would be written, you could interpret it to say it could go up to 35.
This sounds a little crazy to me already, but you could even do something that was proportional to the encroachment. In other words, if your structure is 10% of the way into the impact zone, you have more latitude than if you're 50% into the.
And that actually, and since this is also non-conforming, I'm going to bump to this next slide too, actually ties into this next piece of the non-conformity, and maybe some of these standards would be applicable for this as well. But this is something, again, existing in our current city ordinance that says lots of record with an existing non-conforming structure that will be removed or nearly removed down to the existing foundation. So this speaks to basically a tear down. May apply for a variance, so it would have to go through a variance process and be approved to maintain that existing nonconformity with some restrictions. And this is where it gets into, as you were speaking, Committee Member Fisher, it has some calculations that's based on how non-conforming you are. That reduces your side yard setbacks, that reduces your height as well. This was one, again, that the DNR had a couple of questions and feedback on. Specifically, they thought that limiting that height to 25 feet seemed like it would be reasonable, making some restrictions that you can't use permeable pavement or things that would allow for permeable pavement should not be allowed for driveways and no variance allowed to do so. And then they did have a question, which I think is a good policy question and something that we're going to also discuss with the Planning Commission, is that why would we want to allow the construction of essentially a new structure that doesn't meet those setback standards if it is physically possible in a tear down situation to have it move to meet those setbacks?
Technically, the variance already requires that you can't meet the law. That is, you not supposed to grant the variance just because somebody asked.
Right, yep, there has to be underlying reasons why you can't.
Why by the conforming is overly restrictive. And I guess maybe just strengthen that, include that messaging here, so that if you've got a 500-foot deep lot and you happen to have a small structure that's 50 feet from the lake, and there's no real reason why you can't build a new structure at the appropriate distance from the lake, that you shouldn't get a variance. And again, a mitigating factor might be what are the neighboring structures? If the other structures are all up there, that might be a reason that you want to allow them to be closer to the lake than they would have to do. You're writing. Sorry. What's the rationale here with the permeable pavement should not be allowed for driveways and no variance should be allowed to do so? Why was that feedback to this particular?
That was feedback to this particular item, yes. So I think they were looking, the DNR was looking to, again, see what are some offsetting standards that they could provide. I do not know the specific rationale as to why they pointed that out in this section, but this was specifically to this section, yes.
Would impervious pavement be allowed and permeable pavement not allowed? That's what it says. Unless there's something else
Right.
that you can't do a driveway. I'm confused by that particular language.
I'll do some follow-up and see if I can get better clarification as to what they're suggesting.
It's not clear at all. It would make more sense to just say that no driveway is allowed. Maybe that's what they thought they were saying. I don't know.
Be a little tough to get to your property.
Normally, you don't put driveways to the lakeside.
Oh, this is coming from the lakeside, yeah. Goes back to that question which is in front of us.
Yeah.
Asphalt, so that's why I'm questioning this.
I'll get some further clarification on what it is specifically they're suggesting on that. So again, I think these two somewhat tie together. I think the higher level question for this group is if you are in favor of maintaining or recommending that these abilities and flexibilities stay in this ordinance for feedback for the planning commission, and if we again are agreeable to some of the things that the DNR is suggesting as far as how we would make these work.
I personally like the idea of 25 for meeting the resident requirement, whether it's a tear down or expansion.
And you just set that as the height limit for both of those non-conforming.
It might, I don't know if this is feasible or not, but the important factor here is the height above the base of the building on the lake side. And of course, that 35-foot limit is, I recall correctly, measured from the average height of the ground around the structure.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
It's very common because lakes tend to form impressions for people to be building on slopes. So it may be, for this particular issue, that the height limitation should be on the lakeside versus the ground level on the lakeside rather than the average ground level. Again, 25 feet, 2 stories seems sufficient for encroachment.
Now, if there was a 3-story house already there and they were tearing it down, should they be limited to the 25 feet or should they be able to go to the?
If you're truly turned down, in many cases, you are required to build to the rules. This is an exception that is sometimes granted. In fact, there specifically is required to be a variance. If you have
I do think, though, as you said earlier, Lance, that there should be, the council, or whoever's granting the variance, should be able to take into account the neighboring structures.
And as Committee Member Fisher, as you mentioned, currently our variance ordinance is very prescriptive as to what findings of fact need to be in existence to grant a variance. Again, financial is not, cannot be the factor, saying it's going to cost too much for me to not, or to meet the regulations. It has to be something that is created not by the property owner or a previous property owner. So again, just because the house is there or was there before isn't necessarily enough to grant a variance. There has to be other reasons why that structure cannot meet the
It could be
the ordinance.
Or is the only buildable
Yep.
area on site.
Right.
Something like that. I know we wrestled with the watershed with the issue of footprint, where people wanted to build something that had such a large footprint that it didn't meet the impervious surface requirements or the variance on that. And in most cases, it wasn't granted for, you just end up building, if you've got a lot that's too small to build the house you want to build,
Right.
you need a different lot with a smaller building. But that was a very common request.
Mhm. All right, any other comments or feedback on non-conformities? I think that's some good information to take back to the Planning Commission.
Make your computer easier to use.
I was hoping that wasn't me.
Wow.
All right, land uses. So as you'll recall, in our last joint meeting, we had some specific questions related to mining and to agricultural feedlots. So we did get some confirmation from the DNR on those two questions. So to both, yes, we are able to make those not allowed uses within the shoreland. And so I believe that the intention of both this committee and the Planning Commission was that if we are able to do that, that we would like to see that as not allowable. So we will be changing that within the land use section, that in the red line, that mining and expansions of agricultural feedlots is not allowed within a shoreland district.
So does that mean if I find gold on my land, I can't mine for it?
Well, is this the shoreline zone or is this the shoreline zoning district?
This would be for the entire shoreland district, so within 1,000 feet of those water bodies.
Okay.
So that is something to consider, is that if someone in a shoreline finds gold in their property, that currently the ordinance would make that a not allowed use to mine that.
I think you could get a variance.
Gold in them hills.
Any disagreement with that? Or again, I think our intention will be to update the red line to show that as not permitted use, and we'll bring that to the Planning Commission to discuss. All right,
You know, this is kind of a,
That was true for both animal feedlots and the mining.
correct.
this is kind of a little bit off topic from that, but perhaps a topic that we might discuss in the future about companies or, coming in and taking a percentage of the water out of a lake to do a variety of things, whether it be making purified water for bottled water or something. I think there was some legislation that was being proposed.
Yeah, I don't think that that's likely to belong in a zoning ordinance.
Yeah, so, but that's why it just made me think of it, and so I guess it's a question to put as a topic for the future for the Lakes and Water Quality. So sorry to distract, because I know the meeting will probably be long as it is.
All right. So lot area and width standards, this is one of the main areas that we've had a lot of discussion on. We've made a lot of revisions and changes, and as you'll recall, I think at our last joint meeting, the thought was that perhaps we maintain the current higher standards for those lakes that are within the Victoria city limits, and we reduce those down to the DNR minimum limits for those that are outside and are not as developed. So that was presented to the city council and that kind of line of thought. And the council did express that they had some concerns over having different standards between different sets of lakes as those growth areas come into the city limits. A majority of the council preferred a single standard, although there was one council member who was in favor of this approach of having some different standards between what exists now today and what has not yet been developed. So I'll open that back up to discussion and feedback as well, but just wanted to present that there was a little bit of a concern on the council side about having different standards for different lakes. And I don't mean different standards between the lake types. I mean different standards between within and outside.
My initial concern is changing the rules for people who have already purchased where they are based on what they have. Making them less restrictive.
I agree that is one of the major concerns I have as well. A subset of that would be minor subdivisions, and I'm wondering if we could just preclude minor subdivisions that don't meet the old limits. I don't know if that's legally feasible, but that would remove a lot of the risk, I think. Is that a minor subdivision is where you have a lot and currently it's too small to divide into two lakeshore lots. But with the new rules, it could become suitable for two lakeshore lots and you split it and build two structures and so on. That to me has the greatest potential for adverse impact on existing developed areas. The only other, I have one other question, and that is, can you elaborate all as to what their concerns were?
It really was, just wanting to be consistent so that if they've got, again, looking to the future, assuming some of these areas with these lakeshore lots were annexed, and now you've got different standards for the same type of lake within the city. So this lake over here has a 40, an acre minimum, and this lake over here only has a half acre minimum, even though they're both recreational development lakes. So it was really a matter of consistency. I don't know that they were suggesting that they wanted to go with lower the DNR standards for everything, just that they had voiced some concern about wanting to have that consistency.
So it would certainly be acceptable to me, and I suspect everybody else in here, if they simply maintained the existing limitations everywhere. We were looking at trying to provide some flexibility in areas that hadn't been developed. I do think that it's not that complicated deal. I think you would just have to simply designate by some means which areas fell into which requirement.
Mm-hmm.
And beyond that, I think maybe the pushback is coming from the rather undefined notion of developed versus undeveloped.
Mm-hmm.
I think what you'd have to do is just identify parcels and say these parcels fit with these rules and these parcels fit with those rules.
Right, and administratively, it would not be a difficult thing to do. We've already kind of, nothing official, but started kind of circling lakes on the map, right? So administratively, to be able to identify those areas is not difficult.
You could make it so that any riparian land that was brought into the city that isn't in the city now could use the more relaxed rules.
Mm-hmm.
That would be a pretty straightforward way of doing it. Wouldn't cover everything, but it would probably cover enough to make everybody happy. Again, the big concern that I have is exactly where Ann is everybody that's already built according to existing rules will feel that they've been taken advantage of when somebody else can come in and do something that they want to do but couldn't.
Yeah, I agree, and I think, you see it all the time, that, for whatever you're in existence as of 2020, these are the rules, but as of 2020 going forward, these are the rules. And if I am not mistaken, I think the thought behind being less restrictive is to encourage developers to come into Victoria and to build, and we don't want to have our requirements so strict that nobody wants to come here.
It is, and that was, Councilmember Gregory is the council member who again was not opposed to having these different standards, and that was the point he made as well at the council meeting, is that if you've got these undeveloped lakes that are not already have established neighborhoods and homes, is when you've got the very high standards, which we do have and which we're proud of in Victoria, it makes it more difficult to get development around those areas in the future.
And our standards still are going to be high.
Mhm.
They just might not be quite as high as they
Right.
were.
So, I don't know if there's any dissension here, but I suspect we have a consensus that either having separate standards that cover what is currently undeveloped, in the matter of generating a specification of what that means, and then having staff identify any property that's currently in the city and that meets that criteria, and adding anything that's annexed. I would suggest something along the lines of if less than 50% of the lake shore is developed, that any undeveloped property meets, can work with the last rules, but that number is arbitrary. That feels comfortable.
I will make some clarification on some of the memo that I sent in regarding this early on. I made the example on my land because I could make the example to show how drastically different the recommendations are from the current standards. And I would say I disagree with changing the standards because it seems that there's only one lake that we're discussing that hasn't been developed. And to put a different standard on that lake would suggest that, it's less than the character of Victoria. I think there's already elements in place in the ordinances, like a PUD or a variance, that could be used to create a different standard for a lot or a piece of land on that lake. I think it really is creating a unfair. Obviously I don't want this to happen in our lake, but it isn't all about my backyard. I think that the residents of Schutz Lake who worked very hard on the Waterford Landing process did that not just because it was the lake in their backyard, but because it was what Victoria is. And so I think if you change the standard at this point, it's not fair to past developers. It's not fair to residents who have land. It's not fair. You just need to maintain the standard as it is. If you think the standard is too high, then change it across the board. But to bring it down to the DNR's minimum standard, I think is absurd, honestly. I think it's not what Victoria is. And we have been, and our past administrations have been very conscientious about protecting our lakes and protecting our environment. So to reduce it down to a half-acre lot and 80 feet and 75-foot setback is not what we are. So I emphatically disagree. I don't think that you need to change the standard for one lake. If a developer wants to come in and develop that, they can do a PUD. And Victoria is the third fastest growing. We don't have a problem with developers wanting to come to Victoria. So I don't think the argument that developers can't develop is a valid argument. I think that we need to protect our lake, we need to restore our lakes, we need to protect our environment, and we need to maintain what Victoria is. So I would emphatically disagree with separating two different standards and reducing it to the recommended standards that you currently are recommending. So that's my stand.
And just for some clarification, so we did take a look at what those lakes outside of the current city limits would be. The primary lakes would be Pearson and Parley Lake as recreational development, and then there are 3 natural environment lakes, Turbid, Marsh, and Lutsen, that I think would be potentially have developed. So those would be essentially the 5 lakes that would have the different standards in the way this is currently written.
I truly believe it's one of the lake that you have to look at what's going to happen in the future in terms of annexation. And while I agree with you, I would prefer it to be the current standard extended or maintained. But I would absolutely hate to see a reduction to the DNR standards applied everywhere. So again, from my perspective, the choices should be either leave the standards as they are or set up 2 separate districts. And again, I would counter Deb's statement that
Undeveloped.
Right.
I think that has to be quite clear. I mean, if I have a lake that we annex that has 2 homes on it, is that considered to be developed?
The way that the red line is written right now is that anything outside of city limits would be considered an undeveloped lake. So we are considering developed as within city limits and undeveloped outside of city limits.
that would be an easy distinction. Obviously,
But does
outside
that-
city limits today, because it becomes inside city limits when you have the ability to.
City limits within what has presently been annexed, or is intended to be annexed or approved in a short period of time?
City limits as it stands of when the ordinance would be adopted would be considered the developed lakes, and then anything annexed after that point in time would be constituted as the undeveloped lakes, in the way, again, that it is currently
So
written.
if we did that, and then within 6 months or a year afterwards, the annexation went through on the other property, are we then saying that we were considering it to be undeveloped before and setting one set of standards and then bringing it in a year later saying it's annexed, and how would we manage it?
No, I think the intention would be, and maybe the verbiage isn't right, and again, this is all up to debate and can be changed.
That's why I'm
Yep,
unclear
yep.
about it, because I don't know if we
the-
have a good definition of developed.
The
and
intention
undeveloped.
would be that any lake within the city limits as of the date of the adoption of this ordinance would maintain the current standards we have today.
You wouldn't have to date it as adoption date, you could date it in the past or in the future.
Right.
You have to pick a date and say, and then basically you identify the properties.
Right, and then anything annexed after that date would fall under the new standards.
Honestly, I think it's just wrought with legal challenges in the future. I think you're just setting yourself up for, real estate attorneys, and I think it's a bad idea. I just keep it consistent across the board, keep it what it is. I mean, you said at the city council meeting the other day, it's 2 lakes you're talking about. Maintain the standard, and then there's a PUD process. So, and on those lakes, what do the residents that currently live on there, and what does Schramm Winery think about? Our lake is less important, so we can we can trash it with high density developments, and it seems a very bad idea.
Okay, first of all, I don't believe that the PUD process has defined here at all. And secondly, it's pretty clear that the intent that the city council had, or whoever had it that started down this road, was to make it more attractive to developers than it would otherwise be. Whether or not that's justifiable is hard to define or decide. But I can clearly see that it's more attractive to developers when they can get higher density. And that's what it boils down to. That when you talk to any developer, it's density, and maybe location.
And the shoreline just isn't where you make up your density. It's not. I mean, we need to protect the shoreline.
Well, I don't think we need to go back and forth. We understand your point of view. I don't think it's not a legal problem. Ordinances have this sort of thing in them all the time, so I'm not concerned about that. I absolutely hear your concerns. To me, as I think Lance stated, my feeling is We don't want to change what's happening on development. That seems like, I think everybody agrees. I'm open to lesser restrictions on the new developments or the whatever.
Honestly, I don't agree with that point,
I know
Ann.
Debbie's not, let's hear from some other people.
Yeah, I don't agree with that point though, Ann, about it's not fair to landowners. I mean, not that I want, not that I want Lance to develop his land, but it's not fair to him to say, you can do this over here, but you can't do it over here. It's not fair and equitable to a landowner to say he can't develop it.
Differentiation exists all over zoning.
And it's valid points. I hear your points and those are valid and those are.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify because you said I think we all agree, and I don't.
It's ever need where we should go.
Right.
I suggest that we ask everybody 3 questions. Is maintaining existing standards acceptable? Is having 2 sets of standards acceptable, or is reducing the standards everywhere acceptable?
Or just your thoughts, Steve.
I'm mixed on it. I mean, actually, I'm fine with any of them. I look at our lake, which is Pearson Lake, and we've got large stretches of undeveloped land, and then we have spots of where cabins where the lots are 80 feet wide, and then you've got neighborhoods where they're 100, 125 foot wide lots. And now, when the lakes, when it's annexed in and developed, I don't know what the best way to do it is. Should there be, I mean, I forget what the standards we had on there for lot widths on the recreational lakes, but the difference between the two.
I think it's 100, and then it has to be dropped to 75. Is that right?
80, 100 to 80, I believe, or it might be 75. I think I've got it on here. Hold on.
Yeah.
So recreational development, it would be from an acre to 20,000 for square footage for riparian, and from 20 to 15 for non-riparian, and then the width is
75.
yep.
Which is awfully narrow.
Would be 80. Recreational would go to 80, from 125 to 80.
Okay.
Nearly,
It does seem awfully dense.
that is. It's also, the reason these numbers are in there though, is that it's really consistent with other developments on similar sized lakes.
Yeah.
Around metro areas, so that these aren't just arbitrary numbers that the builder would want to squeeze everything in. This is what Victoria's competing with.
Well, I'm thinking back to when they were doing the 2040 plan, and they had different classifications of lots, and some were like natural lots where they had to be bigger acreages, and it seems like and I don't recall if some of those were targeted around the lakes too, which would that solve the problem of, because in some spots 75-foot lots are fine, but in others like we've got 14 acres, and someday that'll probably be developed, and I would hate to see it in the 75-foot lots, but I'd hate to limit somebody else too.
Yeah, I believe that in the comp plan around Pearson, it's all low density residential.
Okay. Which would mean what for the lakes? Are the 75
Yeah,
foot?
I think it's like, it's actually unit per acre. It's 2.25, I think is the 2.25 to, oh gosh, I should look that up. Do we have the comp plan? Can we pull it up? I don't want to say something that, right.
And it could be 1,000 feet deep and 80 feet wide to meet that requirement.
So are you suggesting you would be not in favor of reducing requirements in undeveloped areas?
I'd be okay with it. I'd be okay with any of them, to be honest with you. Sorry, not to take a strong opinion, because it's different in different spots.
Yeah. Right, no.
I guess I don't know if I know enough about this topic to really have a strong opinion. I think keeping everything consistent, whether it's developed or undeveloped, understand why we would have two different rules. And really, it's just it's a lake, lake's a lake.
Would you find it acceptable if we reduced the minimums to 75 feet from 125 area?
What's in, right now it's 125? I guess I'm in favor for keeping, well, I don't guess, I'm in favor for keeping it at 125. That's what it is now, we make it small.
Okay,
Just to jump in here, low-density residential in the comp plan is, average density ranges from 2.25 to 6 units per acre, is what low-density residential is defined as in the comp plan.
Let me ask give you an example and see what would happen with it. There's some cabins out on our lakes, which are small, and eventually, I mean, you're seeing them now torn down and turned into houses. And if they don't have, if the lot was like 100 feet wide, and the cabin was small, where it's gonna need a bigger footprint, what would happen to that with the setback? Would they be able to rebuild there?
Yeah, so and this has happened historically in Victoria as they've annexed, any annexed property would be if it didn't conform to what the new standards were, would be a legal non-conforming lot and would be able to maintain its non-conformity based on, again, some of the non-conformity rules that we're putting into place.
But it would be subject to what was before, where when the footprint wouldn't be able to be expanded, but it could go taller, or?
Well, again, it would depend on
If it's-
setbacks
okay.
and how close to the lake it would be. So that it would get into, if it did not conform with what the new ordinances would be, it could maintain its non-conformity, but it would have some of those restrictions for expansion and that type of thing. Tear downs, again, specifically to the thing we noted.
But
That-
specifically, you wouldn't say to somebody, well, your lot's too small for the requirement, therefore you can't build it.
Right, yeah. If it's an existing lot of record and there is a house there already, even if it's too small
Yep.
for whatever the requirement is, that it'd be a legal lot of
But if
record.
they wanted to expand the size of that house with the width of that house, that would be prohibited.
Well, not necessarily.
I'm asking.
I think that there's a
I mean, because if you look at the scenario, and there's one on the board right there, if you look at Mound, that was a whole area that was cabins. And that's why you see, as you're looking up there, 50-foot widths. And what they've insisted on now is that basically you have to have two lots in order to build the house that you want to build, so that you've got a 100-foot width. But they wouldn't let you take a 50-foot width and try to put a house out to the edges of the lot at all.
Right, you'd still have to meet the setbacks, yeah.
Well, the setback is one thing, you have a setback, the side setbacks as well. Yeah. So I mean, saying that they can build is one thing, saying that they could conceivably use the existing foundation and put a newer small house on there, or a newer small cabin, okay, fine, I can see that. But I'm saying that you'd have a footprint restriction from what was there before with the foundation.
so Dick, since you're talking, what are your thoughts on either maintaining consistency, allowing less restrictive?
Well, number one, I want consistency in setbacks, okay? So we're not changing that. I mean, if there's an existing house and they didn't have the setback, we'll live with that. And we could live with the situation of building on that same foundation. Okay? But the setback to me is something that should be maintained with new developments as well as developed and undeveloped. It should be
This is
consistent.
mostly about people putting developments on unbuilt lots.
Lot width.
Yeah,
Well,
but what I'm saying is an unbuilt lot, it still should have the same setback that we've got, the setback requirements that we have, that we've used with the DNR and other things. If there's one or two houses on the lake, I'm not ready to move all of the setbacks up to match the house that is there existing. It's a grandfathered situation with the existing house.
So
Okay, and the foundation is, if you want to, that's the next step of that. Do we allow them to rebuild a house if they use the same foundation?
I think I'm talking about something a little bit different, so we're just talking.
But I'm just, that's one aspect. So what I'm saying is any new parcels that we have out there would have a setback requirement on them for the new development.
But the real question is, should we
So-
reduce the setback from
125.
No, that's the width.
The width.
So the lot size and the lot
Setbacks are,
width and the setback are the
here.
other questions.
The changes that are proposed is width
100 feet back.
Well, the width,
requirement.
the width requirement, I'm one that says that it should not go down very far, because if you want, it's pretty common to have a house that's with their garage, okay, that's gonna be 70, 75 feet wide.
So are you saying?
And I don't think you should be packing them in so that you've got no side yard setbacks on this thing.
Well, I don't think that's the proposal.
No, in the situation, if there was an 80-yard minimum lot and a developer wanted to do an 80-yard minimum lot, they'd still have to meet the 10 and 10 side yards, so they'd be limited to a 60-foot width house, right, in that situation.
Marty, question here.
Yeah.
So when I built my house 31 years ago on Lake Virginia, it was a setback of 100 feet.
Yep.
Is that still standard throughout the city, or has that been modified?
So that's still standard for Virginia's recreational development lake, I believe. So that is still standard in our current ordinance. And again, with the scenario we've been talking about where lakes within the city limits would keep those standards, that would stay towards the future too. The difference would be is that any recreational development lake, so Pearson and Parley Lake, would have a shorter, a little bit less setback to 75, which is what the DNR standard is currently. But yes, our standard in Victoria is still 100 for recreational development, and under this scenario for those lakes would continue to be 100.
How would you feel if they enacted this change and your neighbor decided to rebuild his house 75 feet from the lake instead of 100, like yours and your neighbor's are?
You're addressing me.
Yeah.
With your mask on, it's hard to I like a 100 feet setback, and I know there's been a large home built on Virginia in the last year or two, and I'm sure it was built on the original foundation, which was not 100 feet, and it's okay. But you can certainly tell that it's far closer to the lake than other homes are. And I said, I'd rather have seen it back, but in this case, they couldn't do that.
Well, I think we have consensus that we don't want less restrictive regulations regarding stuff that's there, and we're a little divided regarding the new development. So I think you can bring that discussion to the planning commission.
Well, again, I say what is developed and what is undeveloped. If there's one or two houses already on a lake, is it considered to be developed?
That's something that should have to be worked out.
I'm saying that's not a good scenario. That's where you're going to have we're going to have problems. They're going to say, "Oh, this is undeveloped. There's only one or two houses on it." Well, is that the truth, or is that?
Well, and
where
again,
where is it? If it's 50% of what we've got laid out for width, is it still an undeveloped, or is it a developed?
and again, just to clarify, the way it's written right now is that anything that's outside of the current city limits would be considered undeveloped, regardless of how many homes are on those lakes.
And I think that's a mistake.
Okay, thank you.
And I would ask that question that hasn't been asked, is there an option between the extreme minimum standard of the DNR and the current standard? So have you discussed at all what if it was, instead of half acre, it was 3/4 acre for a riparian? Or what if it was between a quarter and a half for the non-riparian? And then you kept it consistent. I mean, I think it's clear that I'm not in favor of reducing the standards to the low standards of the DNR. And I'm in favor of consistency across the board, because I think that's fair to property owners, it maintains consistency throughout the city. I think it's just disingenuous and it's inappropriate to have different standards for different places, whether it's developed or not.
So if you had to choose between a 75-foot setback and was it 75 or 80 foot width everywhere versus a split, you go with the
I think I would suggest something in between there, right? So I think everyone feels like a 100-foot setback from the high water mark is appropriate. So no matter what, it seems like everyone here thinks that. You have, you're between an 80-foot width and a 125-foot width. So, what if you said something in between there? You're looking at the difference between a half-acre lot riparian and a 1 acre. So what if you cut it in the middle and said 3/4 and you had consistency? I'm suggesting maybe the question needs to look at consistency with a number that has a high standard that Victoria has a reputation for. So it's higher than the DNR's minimum, but maybe it is lower than what it currently is.
Do you find a less reduced standard?
Perhaps. I'm just throwing that out there as a perhaps, so there's consistency.
Yeah, I'm against that. And I think maybe we've gone around this.
Very good feedback. I appreciate the different opinions. I mean, this is great, excellent information for the planning commission. So thank you for the discussion. I appreciate it.
If you went back to that, if you went back a second.
You-
Okay.
to
So, to what you have right now for, for the widths that were there for Victoria. Because you've got current, okay, and then you've got developed, and then you've got undeveloped. Why would we, on the one we're looking at, why would you take it and drop it way down on the undeveloped?
Okay, we've talked about this now.
I just don't, I don't understand the
Anne's
rationale.
tired of this
You're trying to
I don't think we're getting anywhere.
I'm very much in favor of just keeping them the same as they are now.
I say there should be a consistency,
Okay,
I
but
believe that.
consistency is only half the question.
Yeah, well, I'm saying,
Consistently loose or consistently tight?
well, you asked 3 questions, right? And I'm saying consistently that they should be tight. They should not, tight together, I'm saying a tighter, higher standard.
Stricter standard.
A stricter standard.
You're opposed to keeping them where they are.
Right. We're all in favor of that.
My concern is if the council is set on reducing them for the purposes of attracting developers, that I firmly don't believe we should reduce them everywhere.
And I don't know I don't know that that's the case.
Well, I don't know what their intent is, but I do know that when we had the long-term planning committee, that the consensus was that we didn't want to just pack in because developers
Right.
wanted higher density. And that was consistent with, I believe, across the whole city.
All right. Thank you. Yes.
How many slides do we have left?
We're probably 9, 10.
We have 21 to go.
No, not 21 to go. I think there's 21 total. 26 total. Yeah. 14. So we've got about 9 to go. 9, 10. And hopefully, some of these are a little bit easier, I think, and less, I don't want to say controversial, but less controversial than the lot width and lot area.
We'll breeze through the rest of them.
Although this one, I think, is probably going to also have quite a bit of discussion as well. So the controlled access lots, I think that we got a consensus from both the Lakes and Water Quality Committee and from the Planning Commission that we think controlled access lots can be a good thing for developments in a PUD to be able to allow some shared riparian access to non-riparian developments. The question that we were left with, and we didn't have a consensus, and I provided some additional information in your background, was related to docking on those lots. So as you noted, the DNR's model ordinance allows up to 6, and then they actually have some calculation where you can have more than 6 in those controlled access lots. So we had been asked to kind of look at what some of the other standards were, which you should have that document in your background packet. We did look at a few different areas to kind of see how they handled these types of situations. Backing up just a little bit, Victoria's current dock under our waterways ordinance allows 1 dock per property. So based on that ordinance, unless we were to change that, this would be limited to 1 dock for that property. So I think that's part of the conversation as well, is that we do currently have an ordinance in place that only allows 1 dock. the question again was, is that appropriate? So I did pull some information again. We had asked to look at the Lake Minnetonka Conservation District. LMCD does have some ability to allow multiple docks in these types of situations. They refer to them as association docks. And I believe that they can go up to 5, if I'm remembering this right.
Yep, that's what you have in your
Yep.
5 docks or 5 watercraft.
5 restricted, 5 or more restricted watercraft.
Yep. Yep. That can be moored there. And then there are some criteria. So as I was reading through the LMCD's guidelines, they essentially treat those multiple docks or those association docks as a commercial dock. So then they have to follow the review criteria of that commercial dock, which has some standards and needs to be licensed and needs to be approved by the board to be able to allow. So that's what the LMCD does. Minnetrista was another one that spoke to something similar to this. They actually have a multiple docks and joint docks policy. They actually, there's a paragraph I included in that they encourage the clustering of boat slips in joint docks and having fewer docks and more boats around them rather than scattering them through. And then they've also got a section on public waters access lots that speaks specifically to those controlled access lots. Saying that they must meet the width and size requirements of residential lots, be suitable for the intended uses. The number of slips allowed will be determined by standards established in this section, which I don't know if I've got a copy, if I included that in here, what those standards were. But they've got a few different things as well. And then City of Prior Lake was another one that spoke to these controlled access lots as well. They limited them just to general development lakes. Also has no more than 5 slips on those. The other, I did look at a number of other cities' ordinances as I was looking through this, and they did not have any language related to controlled access docks or multiple homeowner association docks. So these were the few that I were able to find that actually spoke to this item specifically.
Well, first of all, I'm assuming that Minnetrista only has shoreline on Lake Minnetonka, is that correct?
I believe so.
Okay. I do believe that this is something that's clearly appropriate on a general development lake. I suggest that you might just defer to the LMCD for Lake Minnetonka, which is the only general development lake
Yep.
we have in the city at this point.
And which we do in our current ordinance, defers to them.
Any reason to change that to have 2 standards from 2 different municipalities. And personally, I'm fairly opposed to doing this on recreational development lakes, but if we are going to do it on recreational development lakes, I think it needs to be far more restrictive than it would be on a general development lake, which is what most of those ordinances are addressing. And I didn't see it in, I'm going to back up a slide, I didn't see anything in here. We did suggest last time around that if this is allowed, there has to be some provision in the rule that precludes someone from making a private lake access for a development that isn't actually at the lake.
Yes, and I believe that language, I believe we determined that language was in there and can be clarified if needed. But let me see if I
Maybe
can
it's just
find
not a slide.
Do we have any scenarios like this on any recreational development lakes at this point? Because I didn't think that this was even.
Waterford has a controlled access.
Right, because I think when we talked about that whole development with the PUD, it was, it's a CUP within a PUD, and that was supposed to kind of be the minimum standards for PUDs in this type of scenario moving forward. So I would use that as the template of whatever language is put in the recreational development.
What precisely are the categories for Zumbersani? Because I think there's 2 different.
Which is sunny is natural environment, but
Sunny, that sunny portion, even though it's not a separate lake, is considered natural.
yeah,
And I think we're considered on the Zumber side of the Zumber Bay of that as recreational. And we do have a multiple association dock.
Certainly, if we do restrict it, it's got a grandfather agents there, there's no question about that.
Is that a single dock?
It has, well, yes, it's a.
Single dock with multiple
multi-T-
slips?
Multi-T
Yeah.
with slips on it.
Okay.
yes.
So that it does not meet the Victoria's dock limitations.
Okay.
How many boats are on that one?
Well, right now, there's probably 8 to 10.
Oh,
The intent was that we would have provisions. We have 14 lots that are within the summer development, that's within the association, that are not on the lake. And the intent was that if we built it appropriately, we would have enough Ts and slots, there's slips that we could handle 14.
is that when you come in?
It's halfway up the peninsula.
Yeah. That part.
Okay.
So,
So we do have an instance of where we've got more than one already.
as I said, it is a multi-slips off of one main dock.
Virginia has an association dock area also, which there are probably 12 to 14 homes, but there are only 4 boats there. It's the most there's been in 30 years.
Is that on the north end?
On the south end.
On the south end?
Yeah.
Now, are they serving non-recurring owners, or is it just a collection of docks for recurring owners?
If I heard you correctly, and it's hard to hear you all, it just serves the owners, basically across the street from the lake.
Okay, so the non-recurring.
That's all.
The non-repairing.
Non-repairing, right.
That's what
And
he
when I
was
think
asking.
about it now, there's probably only about 8 homes, maybe, 8 or 9 homes that are involved in that.
Okay.
And that's a lot, I think it's a lot owned by, a sliver of land that's owned by those non-repairing homes, is that right?
You know, I can't, with my hearing aids, it's tough, with your mask, it's really tough to hear you, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and is that, I think if I remember right, that's a narrow strip of land that is owned by the homes that aren't actually on the lake?
Correct.
Yeah, that was done a long time ago, yeah. But usually, I mean, last time I was there, which was a long time ago, like one person ever used it, so.
I think there's 4 now, and that's it. They keep it pretty well maintained. They have their own docks and so on.
So in the DNR's model ordinance, which is the language we've got in there right now, something like that would be allowed to happen again, right? You've got a development and they've got a controlled access lot and you've got multiple slips. You can go up to 6 based on that width. If you're larger than 6, the lot needs to be increased in width to make that. If we were to limit this to just what the ordinance says, which it sounds like these other 2 are currently non-conforming uses, those would not be allowed. Again, you'd probably have a legal non-conforming, depending on when those were put in place. Or maybe you have an illegal non-conforming, I'm not sure.
Ours is association-owned lot, and it's extremely wide. It's not deep.
Mhm.
In fact, that's been one of the debates with the city, is that the road has been maintained as a private road. And when we've had discussions with the city about them taking over the road, the issue comes up is that then they would want rights of way on either side of it, and the rights of way would make that a public access. which we've been opposed to, so.
So your question is, do we like the number 6?
It's-
Do we want
The
that?
width of it is, it's quite wide, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, the question is, do we want to allow this type of situation, right? I mean, that's the broad question. Do we want to be able to allow something like what we've got in existence on a couple of these lakes to happen in developments? Again, restricting that it needs to be specific to a development like the Waterford, where it can't just be a random person buying a lot and now all of a sudden providing access. Or do we want to say, if you do that, and if you've got a situation like that, you have to follow the current dock waterway, which is 1 dock per lot?
Right, I think we answered that. I'll speak for myself again, but I think we answered that in all the work that the residents on Schutz Lake did on behalf of the city of Victoria and Lakes, which was that Waterford Landing was, the standards with that for the CUP and the PUD would be the standards moving forward. So I think they used 80 feet of 500 feet or so that they improved or changed from the natural habitat and put 1 dock with 1 boat. I think the dock actually curves as a U, but it's 1 dock, 1 boat for that size of development.
You have said several times you think that it has become the requirement. There is nothing in any single PUD that makes the conditions granted to that developer a requirement in another development.
Right, I agree that that was part of the establishment of the Lakes and Water Quality Advisory Committee, was that the work that we put forth in Waterford Landing would be discussed as moving forward in the PUD. That was part of the reason we started this whole thing, was to protect the lakes from development with large marinas and what other cities have that is not consistent with the character of Victoria. So,
what I'm saying is there's no standard there.
right. Well, I mean, what was established there was to become the standard moving forward.
There is no standard there. There can't become a standard.
What's established within the CUP and the PUD, the amount of shoreland that was changed or improved, I guess, and the number of dock and slip and the setbacks and the buffer and all of those things that were done intentionally, with your work as well, to protect the environment in the lake and the surface use as well. So
that particular PUD had a 500 lake shore. They were allowed to put in 1 dock for 1 boat and the potential to increase to 2 with another hearing.
right.
If somebody else comes into the development that only got 200 feet for shore, how would it work?
Right, I think it was,
There's no standard there for it.
I think it was the percent of the total. So if you had, what is 80, well, 80 feet was 1 lot in the DNR standard, so I think that's why they chose the 80 feet for improvement.
Well, I'm going to interrupt, because
Yes.
I think the staff can certainly look at the Waterford and, right.
Right, I mean, maybe I'm using the wrong words.
As far as, we can go around again, but my thoughts on this is, it says they'll be considered as a conditional use, so it doesn't mean everybody can do this. It means that if somebody comes to the council and wants to do this, or the planning commission, that these are some standards, and then the planning commission can say yes or no. So I personally think that in some places they are appropriate. We've got them on Lake Virginia, we've got them on Zumbra. There might be other places where this is the best use. So I would be in favor of having language, something like this. The number of boats, if it's 5 or 6, I'm not sure what that exact number is, but I'm in favor of the general
How does the
concept.
DNR work with the width? Does it change with whatever the width of that property is?
As far as related to the controlled access lots?
As far as the dockage?
Yeah, so they require that if it needs to be whatever the width of a residential lot is there. So if it were, let's say it's a recreational development lake here, 125 is our width currently. It would have to be 125 feet wide is the minimum that could be. And then if there would be more than 6 watercraft allowed on that 125 feet, then that lot has to become wider to accommodate that. And they've got, I didn't put it in the slide, but they do have a calculation.
That's why I was
Yeah,
asking.
as to how you figure out how much wider that needs to be.
if we're in compliance with the DNR as it's written
Yeah.
today or not, then, I'm curious. But I mean, I believe ours is, is a couple hundred feet long along that edge, so
Okay.
in likelihood, it's a couple lots with, and if you're saying that they're typically putting 6 for every 100 or 125 feet, then we're probably in decent shape right now from that as a guideline.
Yeah, Lance, I just want to say I apologize for using the word standard, because I think guideline is probably more appropriate, what I meant.
Anybody else have strong feelings one way or the other?
I think six votes is too much.
Every situation's different, so I think the conditional thing is the way to go.
The other piece to consider in that is what is the ownership and how is it managed and who's responsible for it.
Yeah, and that is written in the DNR language here. So the lot must be jointly owned by all purchasers of the lots in the subdivision or by all purchasers of non-riparian lots in the subdivision who are provided riparian access rights on the access lot. Then it also requires that covenants or other equally effective legal instruments must be developed that specify which lot owners have authority to use it, identify what activities are allowed, limits the total number of vehicles allowed to be parked and the total number of watercraft allowed to be continuously moored, docked, or stored, requires centralization of all common facilities and activities in the most suitable locations on the lot to minimize topographic and vegetation alterations, and require that all parking areas, storage buildings, and other facilities be screened by vegetation or topography as much as practical from view from the public water, assuming summer leaf-on conditions.
The one I was most concerned about was the parking piece of that whole thing, because if you have a lot like that, then all of a sudden you can't get emergency vehicles through, it's an obstruction, and other things happen.
So it does require the joint ownership, and then it does require covenants or some sort of legal documents that manages those other things.
So that makes sense. I mean,
Lance?
Okay. First of all, I want to clarify the issue of the CUP process here. The ordinance says that we can do this. The city council does not have the authority to arbitrarily say, no, you can't. So just because it is requiring CUP doesn't in any way prevent it from happening if it's undesired.
So there's no discretion.
As long as just keep that in mind, if we allow this, if the developer wants to do it, the city has to grant them the right to do it by whatever limitations are in the ordinance. If the ordinance says, there are 3 votes, they can say you only have 3 votes. But the ordinance says you can have 6 votes for every 75 feet of lake shore, then the city can't deny that. That's just the way CUPs work. And one of my real concerns here is if you combine this with the reduction of lot size and setback and lot width, there could be a significant amount of redevelopment that comes in and says, okay, we're going to split out the back half of our lots, we're going to grant the lake access up to 1 lot, and double the number of boats on it.
And that's a water surface issue. I mean, it becomes a safety issue.
If we don't, if we stick to the original lot size, setback, and lot width requirements, this is less of an issue. Given that there is also a requirement that the outlot or whatever, the lake control access lots be contiguous to at least the overall property that's granting access.
Good point.
So I think this ties into the other one a little bit too. We got to keep that in mind.
I think you had language before, Lance, kind of always was about what would the impact be if it was single-family homes, and the impact should be no more than that.
The restriction is that the impact of whatever is allowed shouldn't be any more than the impact of single-family homes when you're doing a PUD. That's how a PUD impact. This isn't necessarily a PUD thing. This could be just somebody that has the lots that aren't going to make up private access. If they weren't subdividing, it wouldn't necessarily be a PUD. But it's more likely to happen with a PUD.
Any other feedback? Do you have enough information?
I think so. I think so.
Roll that one out too.
All right, so moving on,
One last thing, we discussed something about since I think there's some people that have on recreational lakes, there's a general.
Yeah.
If we do allow this, the numbers should be different on the recreational lakes, so if it's 6 on some of them, 3 on recreational.
Yeah, definitely.
Makes sense.
thank you. All right, so the next section here, placement, height, and design of structures. Again, this is related to the setback. I think we've discussed that with the earlier item. The other question that we did have as a group last time we met was, does the DNR have any restrictions or guidance related to the setback of freshwater wells from the ordinary high water line? The answer I got from the DNR was no, they don't, but it is regulated by the Minnesota Department of Health, so they have restrictions as to how far or where a well can be located. So it would not necessarily need to be in our Shoreland ordinance, as it would be dictated at the state level. I don't know what that is because I didn't reach out to the Department of Health yet, but I was told the DNR said they don't. So that is the answer to that question. We talked about setbacks. Water-oriented accessory structures. So as you'll recall, we had some conversation about the water and plumbing. So I did reach out and I asked if the DNR has ever permitted water or sewer in a water-oriented accessory structure, and if not, what is the reason or rationale? And the DNR's response on this one was that the rules specifically prohibit the use of water or sewage treatment facilities in these structures. To this individual's knowledge, we've never received a request for flexibility on this point, probably because local governments feel it is reasonable to reduce impacts and there's no compelling reason to do so. These small structures are allowed close to the water for the storage of boating equipment or other uses that need to be closer to the water. Because they are so close to the water, any changes to their use that increase human activity in and around them are likely to increase other land and vegetation alterations that negatively impact the shoreline area.
I'm the one that proposed that, so let's just put that in there.
I agree.
All right.
There's a second to that.
Moving on, I don't have anything specific about this, but I know that we've had some discussion about vegetation management and standards, so just wanted to open up one more time for any discussion as to what's currently within the red line ordinance, if we feel that those standards are adequate, if we feel there are other things we need to look at when it comes to vegetation management. Just as a summarization for those of you who don't have the red line ordinance in front of you, it does place restrictions on removal or alteration of vegetation, and there are provisions that it must comply with if you are to do that. That intensive vegetation clearing in the shore and bluff zones and on steep slopes is prohibited. Clearing and trimming of trees and shrubs in the shore and bluff impact zones and on steep slopes is allowed pursuant to provisions of our tree preservation and replacement ordinance. And I know we've had some discussion about whether or not that ordinance is adequate with the ability to essentially buy the tree replacement. And that is something, that ordinance will be our next one we're bringing up with with the Planning Commission. So we'll be bringing that ordinance through the process to talk about that and other items there. And it goes on to with some additional information about screening of structures and the view from the water, making sure that shading of water surfaces along tributaries is preserved, cutting debris or slash shall not be scattered or mounded, retaining perennial ground cover, minimizing fertilizer and pesticide runoff into the through the use of vegetation, topography, or both. There are some requirements for grading and filling, so there is a requirement to get a permit, a fill or grade permit from the city if there is more than 10 cubic yards of material moved on a steep slope or within a shore or bluff impact zone, or the movement of more than 50 cubic yards of material outside of those steep slopes and shore impact zones. So there would be a inspection and review process for folks that are looking to move large amounts of dirt. Also speaks then to the erosion control permits that are required by the MCWD and some additional restrictions and guidance on grading, filling, and standards for grading, filling, excavation. So again, I have nothing specific in this area, but I know it was a topic of discussion, so just wanted to open that up if there was anything additional we wanted to think about or consider as it relates to vegetation management.
Did we integrate into that removal of invasive species and planting of other replacement vegetation?
So I don't know that we have anything specifically to that, but
I'm thinking along the lines of buckthorn and there are others, but that's the one that sticks in my mind.
There should be a requirement to replant if you remove an invasive, or just allow the removal of invasive?
I'm thinking that depending on what you've done, you may have to do some replacement in order to avoid the erosion. So that's why I'm bringing it up, thinking it's something that we should put on there with some kind of guidelines with it.
You certainly don't want to discourage the removal of buckthorn.
No.
Good point.
And it's not clear how much benefit there is from the root structure since it's, very close to the surface. It does, I mean, clearly, you don't want to get rid of erosion.
It's still tough to get them out, believe me, those roots are tough to get out. And the other thing is the buckthorn will choke out your other trees. And
Absolutely.
you starve the roots on the other trees. So.
Absolutely.
So-
I'm for removing all buckthorn
Maybe not a
everywhere.
requirement for caliber inches replacement, but just for a certain density of ceilings or something? Something with a root structure?
Or can you just say,
This-
but efforts must be taken to prevent erosion?
and prevent
You know, that
erosion in the
Yeah.
soil.
Removal of
erosion.
invasives is encouraged, but efforts must be taken to.
Can't create an
And that's
erosion.
more of an education piece, I think, for people that, yeah, we want you to get, do your part and get rid of these invasive species. And then if you're responsible enough to go out and be pulling buckthorn, those are the people who are likely gonna then also be responsible enough to do something.
And I'm presuming that there's also a responsibility from removing things like poison ivy, poison oak, and other things that are, other, should we call them health problems?
Nuisances.
I have just I'm just curious on riprap. Does the watershed district permit riprap? Does,
They specifically require a permit.
Yes.
Construction detail requirements.
so then, do we need our own regulations in here regarding riprap, or should we just reference the watershed district?
That seems like a really good idea.
They're very complete in terms of what the watershed has for being able to, to
Yeah.
get it approved and whatever. The only thing that's going to come up with that, I think, ultimately, is what's going to happen if, in terms of water surface usage, if we ever start to adopt something because of wake surfers, how high they generate a wake. Okay.
That may change the requirement for the height of the riprap.
Well, that's the point, is that the height of the riprap right now is controlled by the watershed district to be the maximum is to be 2 feet above the ordinary high water. But if you're approaching ordinary high water and you've got somebody out there who's wake surfing, what's going to happen is that wake is going to splash over and back cut your riprap.
That's something we should talk to the watershed district about, but I agree totally, and
But-
we shouldn't have anything in here other than a reference to the requirement to get.
Yeah, I mean, they've got the requirements.
To the watershed requirements getting permit, why get involved? And
Right.
If you put something in, and the watershed decides to do something different, now it's a.
Well, it's not just the watershed, it's the DNR and the watershed.
Yeah, well, the DNR and the watershed cooperate pretty well together.
Well, I mean, the DNR basically is delegating the watershed to do that, and to handle the permitting and everything. And right now, they're the ones who are handling the boating surface regulations.
Yeah.
So it all links back to that. It's not ours to get in. Just as a point of interest for everybody, the University of Minnesota is now doing a study on what are the implications of having high wakes from boats. and,
We are, it is in fact a crowd-funded
yeah.
study, so if anybody
Yep.
is so inclined, you can go and donate. So, yeah.
I'm just saying, it's a hotly contested issue right now.
The new hot issue. I got a couple things. One, is it true, I didn't quite follow your discussion, is it true that without a permit, someone can move 50 cubic yards of dirt in the shoreline impact zone if it's not on a bluff?
I don't believe in the impact zone. Let me just read this, how it's written right now. I'll read it out loud. So permit requirements, grading, filling, and excavations necessary for the construction of structures, sewage treatment systems, and driveways, if part of an approved permit, do not require a separate grading and filling permit. However, the standards in section 8.33 of this ordinance must be incorporated into the permit. For a grading, filling, and/or erosion permit is required for the movement of more than 10 cubic yards of material on steep slopes or within shore or bluff impact zones. So 10 cubic yards in the shore impact zone, and then outside of the impact zone, anything more than 50.
Okay, I'm good with that. And, would it be possible to require any new development or new construction, I don't know, at least development, I don't know if you could ever apply it to an individual lot, that there be a, say, a 10-foot vegetative buffer of appropriate materials? Percentage of the shore.
Yeah, and that is something, as you'll recall, we had kind of talked about potentially looking at doing that with going down the PUD route with the shoreline dedication and preservation, and then we've kind of shifted gears on that to go back to the DNR model language. So I guess I'd have to look into that a little further to see if that's something that we could.
I think that was talking about mitigation for, excusing some of the permeable surface requirements. But I'm talking about just in general, for a PUD, it would be, I think, desirable to write something in the shoreline ordinance for PUDs particularly, that some percentage of the shore, particularly if it's communal property shore or city property shore, include a vegetative buffer.
And there is, so when we reverted back to what the DNR's model ordinance says, there is, let me see if I can find the section here where it talks about the percentage of the shoreline here. Where do we have that in here? Because I want to say it's something about if you go the PUD route, part of it is, oh, right, here we go. So open space requirements, so this doesn't necessarily speak to what needs to be in the shoreline, on that shoreline, but open space must constitute at least 50% of the total project area and must include, there's a number of things, and then portions of the shore impact zone, I guess it does state, preserved in its natural or existing state as follows for new residential PUDs at least 70% of the shore impact zone. So that's DNR model language says that if you're granted a PUD and you're provided the updated density, you have to preserve at least 70% of that shore impact zone of the parcel as it is presently. It doesn't speak to anything you need to do to change it, but it says it needs to be preserved.
Would it be possible to add a requirement for a vegetative buffer in that 70%?
Potentially.
Yeah, and I think
That could be huge in terms of water quality impact.
in native, as opposed to natural or as is, because as is
Natural,
would
I
be,
guess, doesn't necessarily mean anything, that could be.
Could be a mess.
Rock garden and some, what's that, that pink one? Forget the name of it.
Purple loosestrife.
Purple loosestrife.
yes.
Yeah.
Not pink, purple.
Yeah, I think there's probably the ability to do that through this PUD process, right? As you mentioned, it gets a little more difficult on on a lot, or even with straight zoning, because with straight zoning, if they're able to meet the standards, they're able to develop riparian lots, so that gets a little more difficult to do. But when the PUD is specifically meant to say we're going to provide some additional density for other XYZ in return, I think that is plausible.
Okay. We can take a look at that. That's all right.
Anything else with vegetation? We're getting close. We're just about done.
All right. Are we talking water, inlet vegetation versus shoreline?
Once it hits the water, that's no longer a zoning issue, so I am not the person to ask. All right, stormwater management. So this is, we had some discussion about the tables and the restrictions, and speaking to the DNR. I think we've come to the conclusion that all residential zoning districts would be set at 25%. That's even if there would be other allowed uses such as churches and schools, they'd still need to adhere to that 25%. And then, as you'll recall, we had some information in the ordinance trying to create that flexibility for the CBD, the downtown business district, and our downtown west expansion. That would allow us to be able to do that with some more flexibility and some standards. And the response we got from the DNR is that we don't think you need to get that complicated in there. They said we can, as long as we just handle it with impervious surface standards of what you've got in place currently, which is what is in our current ordinance is 80% in the CBD. He said we can handle it that way, so we don't need to get into a bunch of complicated definitions to provide how that commercial district, especially because it is a very defined CBD. We don't have any other shoreland commercial districts that are zoned in our 2040 comprehensive plan. So we're really only talking about this area right here in the downtown area.
If you leave it that way, will we still end up with an appropriate stormwater management improvement? I understand that the central business district exists with, already has the 80% impervious surface.
Yeah.
It doesn't already have appropriate stormwater protection, so redevelopment of that should trigger more stormwater protection somehow.
And I know we are with the 13.5 acres, we are taking that into consideration, and we're having the watershed district be part of that process to ensure that. But to your point, yeah, we should have something that states that with redevelopment, it,
Yeah, because the existing
Right.
area could get redeveloped, and that should trigger that.
Yep.
It by the watershed district rules, but just don't make sure you don't prevent that.
Well, and to your point, if you've got 80% of your surface that's impervious in the downtown, the question is, where's it gonna go?
mm-hmm, right,
There's
needs to go somewhere.
Is it gonna go, are you setting up curbing and everything else so it just flows straight into the lake? Or are you trying to route it to some place where it can be absorbed by trees and other vegetation and things like that with the way you're managing it? So it isn't just a question of impervious surfaces, it's
Right.
also how is the water itself and the volume of water being handled?
And I would say in practice, staff ensures that the developments are providing adequate stormwater, but to your point, we should have it in ordinance just so that it is not something that can be.
super critical in this
Yep.
particular area because of the surrounding high percentage of impervious surface.
Look to add something in.
And it's also in this part of the country because of the salt and things that we use on our lakes, or on our roads. So there's other things that are there to consider where the water is. Are they going into catch ponds or is it just flowing directly?
Right.
Are we putting it in holding ponds? Are we treating it? What are we doing with the stormwater? So is there any more in the stormwater management piece at all?
So the stormwater management piece has some information. Let's see where we're looking here. I'm in PUDs.
And if it's in the business district and it has to go into a retention pond, who's responsible for maintaining the retention pond?
Right, and that's a discussion that we're having as well internally, because as we've talked about, it's kind of switched, and neither way has really worked all that great, so we are discussing that internally as to how we manage that going
We've had
forward.
discussion a number of times in this committee, so we do need to address that.
So the other items they have in stormwater management, general standards, when possible, existing natural drainage ways and vegetated soil surfaces must be used to convey, store, filter, and retain stormwater runoff before discharge to public waters. Development must be planned and conducted in a manner that will minimize the extent of disturbed areas, runoff velocities, erosion potential, and reduce the delay in runoff volumes. Disturbed areas must be stabilized as soon as possible, and appropriate facilities or methods used to retain sediment on site. When development density, topography, soils, and vegetation are not sufficient to adequately handle stormwater runoff, constructed facilities such as settling basins, skimming devices, dikes, waterways, ponds, and infiltration may be used. Preference must be given to surface drainage, vegetation, and infiltration rather than buried pipes and man-made materials and facilities. Then it gets into the specific standards, and beneath the 25 and the 80% as shown here, when constructed facilities are used for stormwater management, documentation must be provided by a qualified individual that they are designed and installed consistent with the field office technical guide of the local soil and water conservation district or the Minnesota Stormwater Manual as possible. And new constructed stormwater outfalls to public waters must be consistent with Minnesota rules part 6115.0231. So we do have some specific standards outside of just the maximums about stormwater.
And that talks to it just about from the perspective of the water. Does it talk to it from the standpoint of who's responsible for doing the management on certain properties?
No, it does not.
And I think that we need some pieces of that, especially when we were involved with development. During the construction, it's not uncommon to put clauses in the development contract that make the developer responsible. But unfortunately, what happens is the developer wants to negotiate a situation where he's not responsible for his entire property, only the part where he's doing the first phase or second phase of development that's actually underway. And we've had the discussions in this group that we really need to make sure that we have those responsibilities for what's going on understood completely for the property during the development, and then after it's handed off to whoever the owner's going to.
Has that made it into the red line version anywhere?
No, because like I said, we are still discussing internally as to procedurally how things can work, how they are working, how they're not working. Trying to get a grasp of what currently exists out there and who's maintaining what, so we don't have anything in there yet.
Now, in whatever form you want to do.
Yeah, a placeholder of some kind.
It doesn't get around.
Yeah, a placeholder of some kind for that.
Not on everybody's mind, but it's important.
All right, any other questions, feedback on stormwater? This is the last section that I have, so this is the residential plan unit development section. And as you'll recall, we did divert back to the DNR language on this as opposed to talking about requiring a specific shoreline dedication to the city. So this is just kind of the highlights as to what that says. There's a tier calculation, mandatory HOA covenants governing future protections and preservation, additional 25 to 50% setbacks on top of what's already the standard, and then 50% of that parcel dedicated to open space, in addition to some of those other things we talked about. The one piece that I think was still open for discussion based on our last meeting was related to that tiering structure. I know we had some conversations as to whether or not the DNR model calculation was appropriate as to how much density and how close to the water, whether that should be changed or amended. So again, I will open that up for discussion.
step one here, this is the DNR.
Yep, this is the DNR's kind of guidance handout on this. So step one gives you the tiering, and it's different based on which lake classification it is, how deep those tiers are, and then it has a calculation as to how you can figure out how many units can be built within a tier.
If I recall correctly, the gist of our conversation before was to reduce the wrong term here, to try and constrain the density in tier one and allow it to be greater in the other tiers, rather than the way it was originally set up is kind of the same all over.
Yeah, and just to.
Going on that regard?
Yep, that is where the conversation was, correct, and just to provide some additional context to that. So the way the DNR model is written is that once you've done your calculation, you're able to apply a bonus density of 50% to the first tier, and then 100 to the second tier, 200 to the third, fourth, fifth, and beyond.
And could we consider lowering those numbers, particularly in the first tier?
I think we can, right? I mean, I think we have the ability to do that.
And then make up for that in
Make
the
up for it in the third, second and third tier, yes.
I think you said in the last meeting, like the third or fourth tier. I think
There
was
is
your
no
original
fourth tier.
suggestion.
It depends
Like
on
pushing
the
it further
property.
back.
Okay. But I would like to see your movement in that area to bring it to the planning commission.
And Marty, I think in the city council meeting that you guys just had, you had said that you thought that the Waterford landing fit within this. I'd go back to the setting that as sort of the guidelines or standard for that, because that, so nothing is more dense in those tiers than what that PUD had.
One other thought I had, just came back to me here, the calculation that they normally use allows you to take all of the quote unsuitable land, which is bluffs, wetlands, things like that, and include it in the open space. Perhaps one way to make this a little more palatable is, rather than lower the 50%, but exclude some of that unsuitable area in tier one from that calculation.
When you're making the calculation, sure.
Maybe only half of the unsuitable area counts, something like that. That would be an alternative I'd consider.
Is that because it wasn't developable in the first place, so you're not really sacrificing anything with the
Yeah.
extra density you're getting?
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's kind of cheating.
right, right.
And that's another situation too. I mean, go back to your map, okay, if you would. Because when you look at this map, you've also got a wetland here, okay? Which the distancing from your wetland is another part of this whole thing. So I'm not quite sure.
Well, there is
How you diagram
a setback and buffer requirement around wetlands, but it's.
Yeah,
pretty small.
I'm just saying the way it's being looked at right now is just back from the lake and that wetland is
Yeah.
Yeah, and they do kind of show a sketch as to kind of what that would look like on the slide here, once you figured out your density and your tiering and the clustering of the homes. So they do kind of show.
You know, and this one, this picture right here is a pretty good example of what I was concerned about. And that is, if the wetland happens to be half of the tier one, they've already got 50%, they could have 100%, zero open space other than the wetland. Pack it all in, which would be.
But as you'll recall, there is a requirement too that they need to maintain 70% of that shore impact zone on the property too, as part of the open space. So they wouldn't be able to necessarily cram a bunch of lots right up to the water, because they would have to
Well,
maintain.
and closer to the water, but they could certainly pack them in pretty tight. A much higher density would result along the shore, which is, I think, undesirable.
You're showing them packed in this diagram, you're showing them packed in this area right near the wetland.
Yeah, and
And that goes to our whole water quality problems and other things. If you're getting erosion and runoff and everything else, with stormwater runoff, it's going to directly into that. So that's why I was asking about the diagram. I don't know if it's
and per the current written rule here, there's far more than 50% open space here in Tier 1 right now. So this isn't really representative of what the rule would allow. It would be more density.
This doesn't seem accurate because, or I guess I have a question. If the line along the water is an ordinary high water level, that wetland is also probably all part of that lake, we'll call it, that's a lake. So the ordinary high water level would probably is in that wetland, right? It's a wetland.
The ordinary high water mark would actually be upland of the wetland.
So those dashed lines that they have going through here don't really appear accurate to me. They would be more like contour lines, wouldn't they?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Why do the tiers measure out from the lake rather than from the wetland?
Right, instead of going out the other way. I hear what you're saying.
So I don't know if that's just.
Yeah. I don't know how that's.
I'll tell the DNR you said so.
Do it. Make them answer. I would be very curious how they're going to answer it.
It is true that wetlands can exist well above the ordinary high water.
Yeah.
Sure, yeah. But I'm thinking around here, like Auburn is completely surrounded by wetlands. Is that where it is?
We've got wetlands 5 feet above the ordinary high water mark out on Pearson or so, which would kind of be like that drawing.
But I think no one's real question here is when there is no clear demarcation between the wetland and the lake, where is the ordinary high water mark? Then I think that's a question that should be answered.
Somebody's got to know, right?
Well, there's a lot of things like this that just haven't come up to the level of being incorporated in any concrete definition. It ends up being somebody's opinion, and that's why I think it'd be worth having a look at what
Yeah.
it is defined in that regard. If it's insufficiently defined, maybe work out something.
Right, Marsh Lake is kind of an example of that, right, where you've got a very shallow lake and you've got some wetland, and it's very, it's not clear. Someone would have to go out and someone smarter than I am would have to go out and make a determination as to where that line is, yeah.
And I think sometimes the developer can be forced to do that.
Mhm.
That the city
Right.
can put that expense and,
Right.
you know, work on them to come back and show us where that line is.
Mhm.
It does beg the question of, again, when there is wetland contiguous to the water body, how is that ordinary high water mark defined?
Right. And in these situations, in situations like this, if we do go this route with the PUD and your tiering, I mean, that would be a requirement of the development, right? You need to identify the ordinary high water line. You need to have someone qualified to be able to identify that and provide a written report or survey showing where that line is.
More along the lines of, based on what that definition is, you might want to modify the requirements. You know, I think the assumption has been, in this particular image, that the end of the blue is the ordinary high water mark. If that's not true, that might change the way you want to apply this tiering.
Yeah, and it definitely would. If we were to say that wetland was below the ordinary high water line, and that line comes up to the east side of that wetland, you now have, your tier lines have to follow the ordinary high water line, right? So it changes the whole orientation of that.
And then theoretically, 70% of that needs to be
Right.
part of the common. So all those backyards are not to the wetland anymore. Anyway, something I think you should look into and find out what is the real scenario here, and then see if it affects the way you want to write it.
There's another piece that comes into play, and that's exactly what is the lowest level of the basement of the structure that you're putting in place. And is that a high enough elevation above the ordinary high water level?
Right, and there are,
And I know that's
testing me here, but there's
saying-
some language about how that's
Vertically,
dictated.
it's not gonna, the effect of the wetland would have no impact on the vertical. The ordinary high water level is not the ordinary high water mark.
No, what I'm saying is that the ordinary high water levels here, the marsh part could be, slightly higher, but still not be anything that's buildable, because you can't build unless the elevation is a good 3 feet above the ordinary high water level.
Okay, so in the wetland,
Yeah.
you're adjacent to the wetland.
So does this, where can you start to build in this diagram to do 3 feet above? It isn't just the setback, but it's also 3 feet, the elevation, 3 feet above the water. Because if that's a very flat piece of land, even though this might be 267 feet, if this is, just slight incline, you might find that 3 feet goes almost back to where you've got the 3 feet drawn on this one. We're doing it as just a setback, but we're not taking into account what's happening with the elevation piece of this.
I might be misremembering, but I don't recall the watershed that there was ever a structure-based limitation that was measured relative to water level in a wetland. Relative to the water body is beneficial.
FEMA has some very definitive rules about what is in the floodplain. Yeah. And what is, you can't build in a floodplain, and what the structures can be. So this definition, has to be integrated, when we talk tiers, has to be integrated with what the floodplain
Right.
aspects are.
Mhm.
And I don't know how we make that clear when we're writing this, so that there's both factors being played into this.
It would at least help to know what the definitions are in terms of where the ordinary water mark is drawn.
Yeah, yes. That's one aspect of it, so you can look at where the floodplain, and then you look at the floodplain pieces of it with FEMA, based on what's happening with the elevation of the land that's near the water.
At least in the floodplains and ordinary water levels are vertical measurements, not lateral. So
Correct.
they're pretty clear.
So,
All right. That is it for my slides and presentation. I'm happy to take any questions, or if there's any other areas that anybody wants to look into yet tonight. Here's just kind of an updated tentative timeline that we are looking at with this ordinance. So we are looking to do a public hearing with the Planning Commission next week to get some additional public feedback. And then we have built in a number of other meetings to hold if needed, as we continue to work through this before this would get to the city council, so that as we get additional public feedback and we continue to work through, we've got an opportunity to continue to refine before this ordinance would go to, again, in the tentative timeline, council at the end of August.
Quality or scheduling to actually have a public hearing before the proposed rules are cast in concrete. All too often it goes the other way.
Before, what was that?
The schedule we've got here is having a public hearing next week and having continuing discussions to incorporate feedback before the ordinance is considered in August 24th. A lot of the time it ends up being the other way around. They work out the ordinance and throw it out for a public hearing. And definitely, they can't make any changes without major upheaval. Nobody wants to do that. So,
And I want to thank staff for putting this presentation together. It was very clear. It was a really easy, maybe isn't the best word, but a nice way to go through the ordinance, and you did a good job of kind of highlighting the important things and keeping us on track. And I know that's a lot of work to put it together, but you've done a really good job in leading this, so thank you.
thank you for productive.
Right. So if staff doesn't have anything else, I will ask first, before I look for a motion to adjourn, if there are any miscellaneous items that we need to discuss.
Got one real quick. How did we end up on third Thursday of the month? Aren't we supposed
It
to-
was rescheduled.
This specific meeting was rescheduled, and to be perfectly frank with you, it's because I was on vacation last week, so.
Now, there's an honest answer. We love that.
I'm missing out on an event tonight that I missed last month for another reason. There's only gonna be one or two more this summer, so I'm hoping we don't have no more third Thursday.
No, we should not. We should not.
Thank you for prioritizing us. Appreciate it. Anything else? Or I'll take a motion to adjourn.
I'll move that we adjourn.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you.